I'm in my office. I get a call from Mike Stewart. Mike was the man who was running United Artists Records and Music Publishing for me. And he said, I got a call from London from Noel Rogers, who runs our publishing company in London, and there's this rock group called the Beatles, and they're interested in making some rock and roll movies. I said, what do they cost? He doesn't know exactly, maybe 60,000, 70,000 pounds. I said, do we get publishing? We can get some publishing. We get soundtrack albums? We can get soundtrack albums. I said, if we can get those rights, there's nothing to lose, because those rights will be worth something, even the movies aren't a hit. And you never know with these kind of things. So I approved a 3-picture deal with this group called the Beatles, that of course I'd never heard of.
I remember Brian getting very excited about the fact that the Beatles had been offered a movie. And of course he'd done a deal with United Artists, not for 1, but for 3, as a kind of package deal. And like quite a few of Brian's things, it wasn't all that great a deal. In fact, I believe the movie was made for less money than the first album of the Beatles created.
When the Beatles were first told by Brian Epstein, I can set up a movie for you, they didn't want to do it because they were looking at past track records of the movie business, and the whole standard of pop music on film was not good in the early 60s. They had no storylines at all. You would have a parade of guest artists coming on and performing, not even their hit singles, but you know, a fairly bad single written specially for the soundtrack of the movie. So the press weren't at all moved by the fact that there was going to be a film made.
Britain was just over the moon at this fantastic phenomenon, the Beatles, and they were just as excited, not big-headedly, but look what's happened to us, 4 kids from Liverpool.
And of course, they just exploded. The big challenge to me was suddenly this 3-picture deal we had with this group in Liverpool that I'd never heard of before turned out to be a group with what looked like was going to be a very, very successful act. And of course, there we were, already in business with them. And that's when the decision as to who was going to make the movie became essentially, I mean, was the heart of the matter.
United Artists approached me and asked me if I'd make a film for them. And I thought they had a script or a book or something. And I said, what have you got? And they said, well, we want to make a movie with the Beatles. I said, sure, I'd be happy to. So they introduced me to Brian, and I guess he thought I was okay. And next thing I do, I had to meet the Beatles. Well, the first meeting I had with him, Brian Epstein was supposed to bring them to my office in London, and he showed up on time, but the Beatles, they didn't come. Brian came, and he apologized. He said, I'm afraid we'll have to do it some other time, but they're over at EMI Studios at Abbey Road in on a session that another group that Brian had managed, so I have to go over there to meet them. So I said, well, can I go with you? And he said, certainly. So we jumped in a taxi, and he said, well, let's stop by their apartment here in London first. And sure enough, they all came down looking for a taxi. So they jumped into our taxi, and you know, London taxis are only for 4, so there's 6 of us in there. And I thought I was in the middle of a Marx Brothers movie. Every time the taxi stopped, they'd grab all the newspapers that had Beatle headlines, which they did. And I asked the Beatles, when could we start filming? And John opened up his little diary, and he said, well, we're going to the Bahamas for a holiday. And then in February, he said, we're going to go to your country. We're going to go to New York and do something called the Ed Sullivan Show. And I said, well, that'll be fine. While you're in the Bahamas, write at least 6 new songs for our picture. And John said, well, what's the film about? And I said, I don't know. We haven't got a writer yet. And he said, well, what kind of songs do we write? And I said, Beatles songs. I don't know, 2 up-tempo, 2 ballads. I don't know, write 6 new Beatles songs. And John said, you have a director in mind? I said, yes, another American over here named Richard Lester. And he said, what has he done? And I said, well, he's done some very good television stuff with the Goons. Now, the Goons were an English comedy group that predated the Monty Python group. And Dick had directed their television, and I knew that the Beatles were Goon fans. So when I said Dick Lester, they said, well, get him. And that's how it all started.
I knew Dick through his work with Spike Milligan and Peter Sellers and the Goons, which, of course, because I made all their records. And Dick Lester was an unconventional type of director. He'd grown up in the world of advertising films and shortcuts and all sorts of things. And that kind of led to A Hard Day's Night. So I was quite expecting an unusual kind of movie. And I was glad he was on board, because I certainly didn't want another summer holiday.
I went to Dick and I said, okay, I want you to make the Beatles movie. And he was very intrigued. He says, what do you think it should be? I said, I don't care. It's your responsibility to decide what kind of movie it is, how to make the boys work. Tell me who you want to hire to write this script. Come back with it, and whatever you do, I'm sure we're going to want to go. So the entire creative input as to what this movie should be and how to maximize the talents of this extraordinary group of young men came from Dick Lester, Alan Owen, and Walter Shenson.
I think the Beatles were more interested in not being like the other films than I was, because I don't think I had seen that many of them. I did know deep down inside me that I wanted it to be as natural an experience for them as possible. We were allowed to do it if it cost under £200,000. We were to shoot in March, and we had to be in the cinemas in the beginning of July. I met them in October, the Beatles, in October '63. I proposed a writer from Liverpool. They accepted me because I was a poor piano player, and therefore they at least felt that I would understand where an 8-bar phrase should be and how I could cut round it. They accepted Alan Owen as the writer because he seemed to be able to produce a sound that they could manage to do. And as they say pathetically, the rest is history.
I saw an outline. I don't remember seeing a script. Can you imagine what a script of Hard Day's Night would have looked like? I mean, it would have been 14 pages long and a lot of stage directions. It didn't make any difference. I trusted Dick. He was finding his way. He was dealing with the boys. There was going to be an album. God be with you.
Then Walter Shenson, Alan Owen, and I went to Paris, to the George V, where they were doing one of their first concerts in Paris, and watched them in their hotel rooms, in their cars, backstage, doing interviews. And in essence, the film wrote itself.
This is the first weekend I got to know them, and this was the first put down I got. It was wonderful, because I arrived at the hotel in Grafton Street, went upstairs, and I was parched. I really needed a beer very badly. So I said to Paul, Paul, is there any chance of a beer? And he said, oh, you want a beer, do you? Hey, Alan Owen wants a beer. And Ringo said, oh, does he want a beer? And George said, hey, well, you would, wouldn't he? And so and so. And then he picked up the phone and he said, excuse me, room service, could you send, what sort of a beer do you want, Alan? And I said, a Phoenix. All right. Could you send up a Phoenix beer, please? And 4 large scotches and 4 cokes. And that was, from that moment on, I knew I was in for put-downs.
I remember John saying of Alan Owen, who was a Welshman who wrote about Ireland and came from Liverpool, the trouble with you is you're just a professional Liverpudlian. And Alan said, well, it's better than being an amateur one, John.
I wouldn't take any credit away from Alan. I thought the script, the first one I read, I thought was brilliant, much too long and much too scripted. But it was great. I don't know another writer that could have been as perceptive as that in the short time allowed.
They did a certain amount of ad-libbing, maybe 5 or 10%, but I've got Alan's script, and all the ad-libs that you think are ad-libs were written by him.
And then from then on, it was just the madness of getting ready to shoot, because they then went over to do the Ed Sullivan Show, and their personalities and their success took a fairly big leap forward in terms of the world's awareness. So that by the time we started, our biggest problems in filming were the tactical ones of how can we not let people know where we're going to be filming.
I think it was the day where they're starting at Paddington Station. I heard they were starting each day at a different place, and I got on the train, and of course lots of kids start screaming. It's just hysteria, you know. You can't imagine what it's like. And I remember they were so happy. They're having such a good time, and it was so raw and so fresh. That's what I was missing with all these other things I've seen before, and it was great. It was fantastic.
I've a good mind to thump you, Shake.
Hey, if you're going to have a Barney, can I hold your coat?
He started it.
I did not, you did. On the first morning, we were sitting at tables in the restaurant car in the train, and I was sitting opposite George doing a crossword or something as usual, and the train stopped. And down below there was what had been the bed of a stream, but it had dried out. And both sides of it were thick bulrushes for about 20 feet. And some kids had obviously been running along, trampling them down. And George just said very quietly to nobody in particular, "Oh, look, there's Moses." And I started to laugh, and I thought, I think I'm going to gig out with these fellas because they all had great senses of humour.
The old fella said that could he have these pictures, and Norm said no, and all I said was, well, why not be big about it?
And? Your grandfather pointed out that Shake was always being taller than me just to spite me.
I knew it, he started it.
Hey, Paulie, would you ever sign one of them for us?
Come, Ed, Shake.
When we finished the first day's shooting on the train, they had been dropped off in a field outside of London. The train came back into the Marylebone station. And out of nowhere, again, children were starting to run towards the train. At that point, our clapper loader, who was about 24 years old with the same sort of hairdo, came smiling down, having finished the first day's work with all the negative, and the screaming started. And he panicked, and he thought, I've got to outrun them. And he started to run, and he was carrying 8 or 9 tins of film, and they caught up with him, and the film got dropped, and we lost half the first day's shooting negative. It was lying around under the tracks, and he ran for his life.
Our philosophy was, we chose the filmmakers we wanted to be in business with. We approved the scripts, we approved the budgets. They had final cut as long as the film stayed within the budget and followed the script which we approved. We approved the cast, etc. I had no idea what was going on, other than the fact that Dick was making the film. The word was kind of, wow, this is a strange little movie. And I was just waiting to see the film when it was finished. I certainly knew it was having a certain style, but that's great. I mean, it should be something different.
The sense that there was a slightly surreal element to the film was something that was very important to try to get in. And I wanted to prepare the audience for the fact that they would be playing cards, for example, in a part of the train, and then suddenly in the middle of it they would be playing instruments, and then they would be back playing cards, because that did seem to be something that nobody had been doing. So we used 2 or 3 little signposts, like the boys suddenly being outside the train, banging on the window trying to get in, just to say to the audience, things are not quite what they seem to be.
We didn't concern ourselves with long shot, medium shot, close shot, over shoulder shot. Forget it. We just shot the picture the way we went. And whenever something came up, it was in the picture. When George knocked his amp over on one of the shows, in the picture. Well, that's what it was about.
Yeah, there's one particular scene that stands out in my mind, which was again the genius of John Jimson, was the sequence on the train where John starts to play with the cards and he overlaps the sound before the actual singing starts.
Aye, the Liverpool Shuffle.
It was the first time that I'd ever seen that on film, of preempting the song. And this got you whacked right into the song, and suddenly you felt you were into something also very new again. That was one of the earliest things that John edited, and I was watching him on the movie Ola and seeing him stop and think, which he always did when he cut. He wouldn't do anything immediately like that, but when he did do it, that was it. And I think Pam may agree. I don't remember any alterations to that scene, or to many scenes, of the actual editing. The construction was John, and that was it. They may have taken out a scene, or shortened it by a certain amount.
Well, I had lots of letters from girls all over the world, you know, asking for pieces of their hair, but of course I couldn't. I wished I'd had enough hair to send to them, really, but I couldn't because, you know, it wasn't enough to cut off every week. But they, all lots of letters I had, yeah. They didn't like everybody to be seen with it back. They always wanted to, you know, when we washed it, they always wanted, like this, you know, put their hair down in front. They never wanted to see their hair back. Because Ringo has a grey streak. He always hated to have that showing, so he used to always bring it forward if anybody came in the room, you know, they'd quickly put their hair down. You know.
Well, the funny thing was, we made up the routine there and then on the set. And then Dick would say, well, can you do that step, this shot, this angle, that angle? So there was no rehearsal. We did it on the set. And I have to say that I found that wonderful. it's much easier. You know what the set's like, you know if there's a step there or anything, and you can choreograph your routine around what you've got. There's so much hanging around while they're